so on the arguments front, I'm going to come to the free will. There's a couple of free will ones that are pertinent to the book that I use in the book. But just the last design one is quite a big one and an important one, which is why don't we photosynthesize? So again, to talk about God's design, and if God is ultimately responsible for designing and creating reality, this universe, one of the big problems, as I said before, the natural evil problems are much worse because you can't really connect them to humans. Theists try. The one move that they have is the original sin. So they say, because if you don't have original sin, right, you look at the natural world, you think, goodness me, it's horrible, it's evil, earthquakes, stuff's happening, is terrible, animals are ripping each other apart every day, causing untold amounts of death, right, and suffering. So it's horrible. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Therefore, it has to be humans' fault. So they go original sin. So Adam and Eve fell, the fall. Therefore, it was all perfect before the fall. It's prelapsarian, isn't it? So everything was perfect before the fall, and then it all went wrong. And it's all Adam and Eve's fault. So in a literalistic sense, it's Adam and Eve's fault, or in a symbolic sense, it's humans' fault. But then, like, if you take the symbolic action, it was like, well, actually, there was horrible things going on before humans had even evolved in human evolution. So that doesn't work. So it has to be this literal understanding, which is Adam and Eve just picked a fruit from the tree. And as a result, animals can now rip each other to bits. And as a result, I don't know, tsunamis can kill 230,000 people like that. It's like, but that's the only move the theist has. They have to say it's humans' fault, because otherwise it's God's fault.
But then, Jonathan, you have to believe almost like in a Flintstone type of world where humans were riding dinosaurs. But we know from, again, science has to invoke itself. Homo sapiens are only about 300,000 years old.
Yeah. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense. So the argument that I present is, well, okay, if you're design, again, it's like, what does the data better support? And if I predicted an all-loving God, so if I started with an all-loving God and I predicted what kind of world an all-loving God would create, who had omnipotence and omniscience, so would know how to design the most optimal world, I would say, well, carnivorousness is really problematic. You've got billions of years or millions of years, hundreds of millions of years of animals causing pain and suffering to other animals to merely exist, right? In order that I exist as some kind of mammal, I have to rip apart this other animal and eat it, because I don't get to choose. I'm not sentient. I don't have like free will like humans have, and the ability to talk and do all this stuff and cogitate. I'm just like, I am sentient, but I've been evolved to eat this thing. So I'm going to rip it apart and eat it. And that happens all over the world and has done for millions and millions of years, right? Is that what we'd expect on Omnigod or on naturalistic evolution? Oh my goodness, naturalistic evolution every day of the week. Yeah. So there's no contest. So I made myself watch a video on YouTube once of a baby water buffalo being ripped apart by a pride of lions while it was live. And it took like 5 minutes plus 10 minutes for it to die, as it was just being like literally eaten alive, and it was horrific. I was like, I have to watch this because I really have to understand what has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. And then you say, well, how could it have been? Well, we know photovoltaic cells. You've got an electric car coming, so we can generate energy through the sun. Plants do it all the time. Why could God not have designed humanity and all animals in such a way that we derived all our energy needs from the sun? We can all photosynthesize, and God could do that by changing a couple of physical constants, or just changing the laws of or how evolution works, or perpetual miracles. Just like do miracles all the time. We wouldn't necessarily know, or whatever, but we wouldn't. It isn't necessary, surely, that animals are ripping each other to bits just to survive. It's horrific.
Completely agree. I mean, this is probably beside the story. Has this sort of narrative has led you to contemplate being a vegetarian, or?
So I am actually a vegan. But I was a bit of a sidebar here. I had written pieces when I still ate meat against eating meat, but saying I'm too morally weak to not eat meat. I like it too much, right? And you find a lot of people. I've read some people who I won't name names. So there's a couple of philosophers who I really rate, right, who have written pieces defending the meat industry, and you're thinking, oh, these are just post hoc rationalizations. These are just you justifying your own meat eating. Whereas myself, I'm not going to justify eating meat. It is morally worse than not eating meat. It's just that I am morally imperfect. I was going for the honest approach, which is like, yeah, I'd like to be a vegan. I'm just not quite good enough. And then I developed multiple sclerosis. And one of the options that's advised for trying to deal with MS is to change your diet and to become vegan for a whole bunch of reasons. I won't bore you with them. You either take on a paleo diet or a vegan diet. I opted with the vegan diet. And that gave me the kick up my ass to become a vegan. I actually eat fish as well, just because of the omega-3 and the nutrients from fish, which are really important for MS. But I'm trying to use fish substitutes now, actually. So anyway, I can now lord it over people morally, right? I can just say, yeah, I'm morally better than you. Obviously not. But you know, I understand that these arguments, you know, should lead me towards veganism if I want to be as morally good as I can be. They didn't because I was weak. They do now because I was kind of forced to with my MS. But now, actually, I was speaking to my partner the other day. We went out for a meal and I didn't have many vegan options. And she said, oh, do you want to just have this meat thing? And really, in principle, I wouldn't have had a problem with that. So I was like, no, I am actually now in a position where actually I'm a moral vegan as well as doing it for health reasons. So I'm not going to do that. So, but I'm not one of these people that lords it over anyone else. But I do find it interesting. You can go to a cocktail party and imagine someone saying, hey, I'm a paedophile vegan, right? And they go, what? You're a vegan? So
not that he's got as a choice anyway. I mean, I've turned vegetarian about 4 years ago now, so I'm well on my way for the same reasons. I think it's very good and it's very comforting to live your own principles. It's when you feel that and you go like, okay, I'm at peace, because exactly like for the last 20 years I've been trying to become a vegetarian or vegan, and I was so weak. And I think it's called I was philosophical vegetarian. Like I knew it was the right thing to do. I knew I hated to see that, and therefore the pain and the suffering of these animals are way more important than my taste buds. I knew that.
Interestingly, my moral position weights it slightly more as an environmental choice. So the amount of water and energy required to sustain the meat industry compared to vegetables is just far outweighs it. Like, it's the animal suffering as well, of course, but actually, for me, the environmental argument is a really big winner, and I think eventually it will become an economic argument. Veganism or vegetarianism will become so much more prevalent, mainly due to economic reasons.
Oh, that's the big picture, because if you can save one animal from being eaten, and that's just the sort of the emotional bit of it. But if the whole universe or the planet is collapsing because of certain exercise, then you're saving a whole lot of species at the same time.
Yeah, so it's land use, it's energy use, it's water use, all those things. And if you're producing if you're producing a bunch of crops to feed animals, to eat the animals, just eat the crops, because actually that's a really inefficient process where you're deriving your energy from these animals at the end of the chain, and you're losing energy all the way along there. So it's just really, really inefficient. So anyway, that's why that is important. I'm glad you brought that out, because
I know it's a very interesting proposition there.
That's one of my arguments in the book. So in the book, I talk about how, in fact, it's part of this argument. I say, okay, so why don't we photosynthesize? And then I say, well, why do we even need energy? Why has God created this entire existence where we need energy to merely survive? And then you go, well, you know, because he could have it any other way. It could be perpetual miracles, but we have this situation where we require energy to survive, and that means we are fighting over resources in finite resource areas. This is what nature does, and it's what humans do, etc., etc. So then you say, well, why do we even need bodies if the end game is an eternity in heaven? Which an eternity in heaven, infinite time compared to finite life on earth, which is nothing. It's an infinitesimal fraction compared to the eternity. Then the end game is eternity. If that's where we're going, if that's where you want us to go, don't even bother creating this whole scenario where we need energy and we have to rip each other apart to exist. And we have all this pain and suffering, and we've got earthquakes and tsunamis. Just create us in heaven. And this is one of the big arguments later in the book, is just create heaven. Just put us in heaven. Don't create the ones that weren't going to go to heaven, and create the ones that were going to go to heaven in heaven. Job done. No suffering.
Yeah. Some would argue, though, heaven, it could be a hell. Like the heaven, the way it's portrayed in holy texts, and especially in the Quran. I think Christopher Hitchens said it once. He said, we always sort of imagine the paradise where there's harp music playing in the background, you're laying on the grass, and he's like, you fantasize about this for like eternity, but you wouldn't do it for 5 minutes in real life.
So there are a couple of things. Like, there's philosophical boredom that will exist. So you've got to get over the problem that living for eternity is like, Jesus, you would have experienced everything. And it's just like, so you'd have to be constantly reset in some way. So you got those kind of problems. That's another thing. But as you say, Jim Jeffries, the Australian comedian, did a really good segment on hell. You should go and look at it. There's a 9-minute video on YouTube, really worth looking. And he's talking about how basically all his mates are down in hell, you know, doing drugs, prostitutes, and all this. He's like, that's where I want to be. Oh, being a comedian, I don't justify doing those things, but he's like, and I'm up here with like my priest Uncle Eddie, who used to make me sit on his knee and all this kind of stuff. So so he's like, I don't want to be up here with Aunt Edna and Uncle Eddie, or, you know, all this kind of stuff. Is like exactly that. Is a really great routine. So yeah, check out his hell routine. So yeah, so that is, I think, really, really interesting to talk about, you know, why we need energy, and, you know, why, because again, I go back to this idea, and I said this in the last video, that is all data needs explaining in Omnigod. It doesn't with our naturalistic evolution. It's just shit happens in brute universe and whatever. That's it. It's just how it is. Whereas when you say, well, why do we need energy to survive? Why isn't there perpetual motion machines? Why is there law of conservation of energy? All these things. Like, given Omnigod, you have to explain why that is the best way to exist. Like, whatever the why the sky's blue, why, you know, any kind of data needs explaining in Omnigod. Sorry, you've got some things to say.